Welcome to Dr. Harmony, where we dive deep into the silent echoes of the human heart and the stories that society often prefers to keep behind closed doors. Today's story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the people we would lay down our lives for are the ones holding the knife behind their backs. It is a tale of a father's ultimate sacrifice, met with a coldness that defies nature itself. If you've ever felt the sting of ingratitude or the weight of a broken promise, this story is for you. Lean in, listen closely, and let's explore the shadows of a family legacy built on a foundation of sand. The rain didn't feel like water that evening. It felt like needles against my skin as I stood outside the iron gates of the house I had paid for, with 40 years of sweat and silence. My hands, calloused and trembling with the onset of age, clutched a small suitcase, the only thing I had left of a life I thought was secure. Inside that house, through the warm glow of the window, I could see my son, Min. He was sitting at the mahogany dining table, the one I bought him when he graduated law school, laughing at something on his phone. He looked so much like me when I was young, yet in that moment, he felt like a complete stranger. I remembered the days when his small hand would disappear inside mine, and I promised him he would never want for anything. I kept that promise. I kept it until it emptied me out. I spent my entire life as a ghost in my own home. While other men spent their earnings on new cars, fine clothes, or weekend getaways, I wore the same boots for a decade. I took every overtime shift the factory offered, breathing in the metallic dust of the assembly line, until my lungs felt like they were lined with lead. Every penny was a brick in the wall of my children's future. I didn't see it as a burden. I saw it as a sacred mission. I told myself that if I could give them the education I never had, if I could place them on a pedestal high enough to reach the stars, then my life would have meaning. I was the bridge they walked across to reach a better world. I never expected them to burn that bridge while I was still standing on it. Min was my pride. When he got into the top university, I cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't see my weakness. I took out a second mortgage, worked a night job as a security guard, and lived on instant noodles for 3 years to ensure his tuition was never a day late. I remember him saying, "Dad, I'll make you proud. I'll take care of you when I'm a big lawyer." Those words were my fuel. They kept me going when my back ached so badly I couldn't stand up straight. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? A father believes his son, like a sailor believes the North Star. But stars can be cold, and light years away from the warmth we think they provide. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, like salt water eating away at a pier. Once Min started his career, the calls became shorter. The visits became too busy. When I retired, I realized my bank account was a graveyard of zeros. I had given everything, every bonus, every inheritance, every cent of my savings, to put him and his sister through school and help him buy that beautiful house in the suburbs. I thought I was investing in love. I thought I was securing a seat at their table for my twilight years. I didn't realize I was just paying for my own disappearance. Last week, when my health took a turn and the doctor told me I could no longer live alone, I went to Min. I didn't ask for a palace. I just asked for the small guest room. A place to rest my bones and watch my grandchildren grow. I expected a hug. I expected him to say, "Of course, Dad, you've done so much for us." Instead, he didn't even look up from his laptop. The air in the room turned freezing. He started talking about space, about privacy, and about how his wife felt uncomfortable with a permanent guest. I stood there, feeling the decades of labor crashing down on me. I reminded him of the sacrifices. I reminded him that I had nothing left because I gave it all to him. That was when he said it. The words that shattered the very core of my being. He looked me in the eye, his voice as flat and clinical as a judge delivering a death sentence. "Dad, let's be realistic," he said. "Raising a child is a responsibility of a parent. You chose to have me. You chose to pay for my school. That was your job. But raising a parent, that isn't the responsibility of a child. I have my own life, my own kids, and my own future to fund. I can't be held back by your expectations of a return on investment." I felt my heart physically stutter. The room blurred. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders so he could see the fireworks. This was the man I had built. I left that night without a word. I walked into the rain, the weight of his logic crushing my chest. If love is a debt that never gets repaid, then I was the most bankrupt man on earth. But as I stood by those iron gates, watching him live the life I bought for him, a dark realization began to take hold. If I was just a service provider in his eyes, then our relationship wasn't based on blood. It was a contract, and if the contract was broken, I had to find a way to survive the breach. I wasn't just a sad old man anymore. I was a man who had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. The rain continued to pour, a relentless gray curtain that seemed to wash away the last remnants of my dignity. I wandered the streets for hours, my suitcase dragging behind me like a ball and chain. Every neon sign and passing car light felt like an interrogation. Where do you go when the home you built has locked its doors against you? I ended up in a small, cramped motel on the edge of the city, a place where the walls smelled of stale tobacco and regret. As I sat on the edge of the sagging bed, the silence was deafening. For 40 years, my life had been defined by noise, the roar of factory machinery, the chatter of my children at the dinner table, the constant mental math of bills and tuition. Now, there was nothing but the sound of my own shallow breathing. I pulled a crumpled photo from my wallet. It was Min, at 10 years old, holding a plastic trophy from a soccer game he didn't even play in. I had bought him that trophy because he had been so crushed by the loss, wanting him to feel like a winner, even when the world said otherwise. I realized then that I hadn't just raised a son. I had raised a prince who believed the world owed him everything and he owed the world nothing. I had shielded him so well from the hardships of life that he had grown a heart of stone, incapable of feeling the weight of another person's struggle, even his own father's. The next morning, the shock began to morph into a cold, hard clarity. I looked at my reflection in the cracked motel mirror. My eyes were sunken, my hair a thin shock of white. But there was a flicker of something else. A spark of the man who had survived double shifts and broken ribs just to keep a roof over his family's head. If Min wanted to treat our relationship as a cold business transaction, then I needed to look at the books. I realized that in my haste to give him everything, I had signed over the deed to my house years ago as a living gift to avoid inheritance taxes. I had handed him the keys to my kingdom while I was still breathing, trusting that the blood in his veins was thicker than the ink on a contract. I decided to visit my daughter, Lan. She was younger, more sensitive, or so I thought. I took a bus across town to her apartment, a sleek glass tower that overlooked the park. I didn't call ahead. I was afraid she would give me an excuse before I even arrived. When she opened the door, she was dressed in expensive yoga gear, holding a green smoothie. Her face didn't register joy or concern. It registered inconvenience. "Dad, what are you doing here? I have a session in 10 minutes, she said, not moving from the doorway. I told her what Min had said. I told her I was staying in a motel. I waited for the outrage, for her to grab her coat and tell me to come inside. Instead, she sighed, a long, weary sound that made me feel like a child being scolded. "Min is blunt, Dad, but he's not wrong," she said softly. "We love you, but our lives are so fast-paced. We have careers, social obligations, stress you wouldn't understand. Having you move in, it's a lot of emotional labor. We need to focus on our own mental health and our own futures. Isn't that what you wanted for us? To be independent?" "Independent?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "I wanted you to be successful, Lan. I didn't want you to be heartless. I worked until my fingernails bled so you could have mental health. I didn't have the luxury of stress. I only had the luxury of survival." She looked at her watch, the gold band glinting in the hallway light. "I can't do this right now, Dad. I'll Venmo you some money for a few more nights at the motel, okay? But you need to look into senior living facilities. There are government ones that aren't too bad." She closed the door. The click of the lock was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a final curtain falling. I stood in the hallway of that luxury building, surrounded by the scent of expensive candles and the hum of central air, and I realized I was a ghost. I had spent my life building these 2 towers of success, and now they were looking down at me as if I were a piece of urban blight that needed to be cleared away for a better view. I didn't take her money. I walked back to the bus stop, my mind spinning. I had been a fool, but I wasn't a dead man yet. I remembered an old friend from the factory, a man named Hung, who had retired a few years before me. He had always warned me. "You're giving them too much, Vu," he'd say over a cheap beer. "A bird that never has to find its own worm will eventually eat its own nest." I hadn't listened. I thought my children were different. I thought my love was a shield. I found Hung in a small, dusty workshop in the old quarter fixing clocks. He looked at me, saw the suitcase, and didn't ask a single question. He just brewed a pot of bitter tea and pushed a stool toward me. "They turned you out, didn't they?" he asked, his eyes focused on the gears of a pocket watch. I nodded, unable to speak. "It's the new way of the world, Vu. They call it boundaries now. In our day, we called it betrayal." As we sat there, the ticking of 100 clocks surrounding us, Hung told me something I hadn't considered. He told me that when I signed that deed over to Min, there were conditions. Clauses that a tired, trusting father might have missed, but a vengeful one could rediscover. He knew a lawyer, a man who dealt with the discarded, someone who specialized in the fine print of family treachery. A slow heat began to rise in my chest, replacing the cold vacuum of the night before. I wasn't going to go quietly into a government warehouse for the elderly. If my son believed that raising a parent wasn't his responsibility, then he was about to learn that being a father wasn't just about giving. It was about the power to take back what was stolen under the guise of love. The drama was no longer about my survival. It was about a reckoning. Hung's lawyer was not the kind of man you'd find in a glass-walled office in the city center. His name was Mr. Vin, and his office was tucked away in a narrow alleyway, smelling of old parchment and heavy tobacco. He was a man who looked like he had seen the worst of humanity and decided to document it all. As I sat across from him, detailing every cent I had funneled into Min's law degree and Lan's lifestyle, he didn't look shocked. He looked bored, which was somehow more terrifying. It meant my tragedy was a common occurrence. "You gave him the house as a gift of love in the eyes of the law, Vu," Mr. Vin said, tapping a yellowed fingernail on a stack of documents. "But you mention here that you paid the property taxes and the maintenance fees for the first 5 years he had after the transfer because Min couldn't afford it, while starting his firm. Is that correct?" I nodded. I remembered those years vividly, taking on a weekend janitorial job just to make sure Min's investment stayed secure. Mr. Vin's eyes sharpened. "And did you ever sign a formal waiver of your right to reside, or was there an oral agreement witnessed by anyone?" I thought back to that afternoon in the garden, the sun hitting the roses I had planted for my late wife. Min had hugged me and said, "This will always be your home, Dad. This paper is just for the taxes. You'll die in this house, surrounded by your grandkids." Hung had been there, helping me prune the hedges. I told the lawyer this, and for the first time, a small, cold smile touched his lips. Oral contracts, in the context of family property, can be tricky. But when there is partial performance, meaning you lived there and maintained it as an owner, we have a crack in his armor. But I didn't just want a room in a house where I wasn't wanted. The pain in my chest had hardened into something sharper, something like a diamond. I wanted Min to feel the weight of the floor disappearing beneath him, just as I had. I wanted him to understand that the responsibility he so casually dismissed was the only thing that had been keeping his world upright. Mr. Vin leaned back, his chair creaking. If we play this right, we don't just sue for a room. We sue for the return of the asset, based on unjust enrichment and fraud. You signed that deed under the impression of a lifelong care agreement. He breached that, but we need more. We need to see his books. I spent the next week like a spy in my own life. I knew Min's schedule by heart. I knew where he kept his spare keys, and more importantly, I knew his ego. He thought I was a broken old man waiting to die in a motel. He didn't expect me to be watching. I went back to the house when I knew he and his wife were at a charity gala, the kind of event where they bragged about their philanthropy while their father sat in a room with bedbugs. Using my old key, which he hadn't bothered to change yet, I entered the house. It felt different. Cold, sterile, decorated with things that cost more than my first 5 years of salary. I went to his home office. Min was a lawyer, yes, but he was also greedy. He had been dabbling in high-stakes real estate investments, using the house, my house, as collateral for loans that would make a sane man's head spin. As I rifled through his filing cabinet, my heart hammering against my ribs, I found a folder labeled Project Legacy. My hands shook as I read through it. It wasn't a legacy for me. It was a plan to sell the house to a developer for a massive profit, move to a gated community, and place me in a state-assisted care facility once the sale went through. He had been planning my eviction for months. He hadn't just been cold. He had been calculating. He was waiting for me to get sick, waiting for the right moment to sweep me under the rug like a piece of dust. But there was something else in that folder. A series of transfers to an offshore account. Min wasn't just investing. He was hiding assets from his own firm and his partners. He was committing the very fraud he defended people against. My son, the shining example of success, was a thief, not just a thief of my heart and my labor, but a thief of the system. I realized then that I hadn't just raised a selfish man. I had raised a criminal who used my sacrifices as his seed money. I took photos of every page with my old smartphone, my fingers fumbling. Just as I was finishing, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My blood ran cold. I scrambled toward the back door, slipping out into the shadows of the garden I used to love. I watched from behind the hedges as Min and his wife walked inside, laughing, clutching expensive gift bags. They looked so happy, so untroubled by the ghost they had created. I returned to Hung's workshop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I showed him the photos. Hung looked at the screen, then at me. This is the nuclear option, Vu. You realize that, right? If you use this, you don't just get your house back. You destroy his career. You might put your own son in prison. I looked at my hands. The scars from the assembly line, the permanent stains of grease and toil. I thought about the responsibility Min spoke of. I thought about the cold rain and the locked door. He said he had his own life and his own future to fund, I whispered. He's right, and I have a past to settle. He didn't just take my money, Hung. He took my dignity. A father shouldn't have to fear his children, and a son shouldn't be allowed to profit from his father's grave. I turned to the phone and called Mr. Vin. We aren't just suing for the house anymore, I told him. I want everything. I want the world to see the man I built, and I want to be the one who takes him apart, piece by piece. The hunt had begun. The man who had spent his life saving was now ready to spend his remaining days on a different kind of pursuit. Justice. The days that followed were a blur of calculated silence. On the advice of Mr. Vin, I didn't confront Min. I didn't call him to beg, and I didn't reply to the solitary cold text message from Lan, asking if I had settled into a facility yet. To them, I was a problem that had successfully been pushed out of sight. They assumed my silence was the silence of a defeated man, a man who had accepted his fate as a relic of the past. They couldn't have been more wrong. I was no longer a father grieving a loss. I was a hunter, lying in wait. Mr. Vin worked with a surgical precision that fascinated me. He didn't just look at the deed. He began pulling the threads of Min's professional life. In this world, Vu, men like your son think they are invincible because they have never been challenged by someone who knows their true origin, Vin said, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. He thinks you're too old and too tired to understand his world of high finance and legal loopholes. He's forgotten that you are the one who taught him how to read. We discovered that the project legacy I had found in his office was even more sinister than I first thought. Min hadn't just used the house as collateral. He had forged my signature on a document stating that I had moved out voluntarily and waived all future claims to the property in exchange for a cash settlement that I never received. He had turned me into a legal ghost while I was still eating at his table. The betrayal was complete, documented in black and white, stamped with a notary's seal that I knew was likely a friend of his from the firm. "I need you to go back," Mr. Vin told me one Tuesday morning. I stared at him, my heart jumping. "Not as a resident, as a guest. We need one more thing, the original physical ledger Min keeps in his safe. The digital photos are good, but for a criminal referral, we need the hard evidence of the offshore accounts. He's been skimming from his clients' trust funds. That's not just a civil matter, Vu. That's a felony." The thought of stepping back into that house made my stomach churn. It was the site of my greatest shame, the place where I was told I was a burden. But I knew Hung was right. If I didn't finish this, I would spend the rest of my life in that rotting motel, dying a little more each day. I chose a Friday afternoon. I knew Min had a weekly golf game with the senior partners, a desperate attempt to climb the social ladder he so craved. His wife would be at her gallery opening. The house would be empty, guarded only by a security system I helped install. I walked up the driveway, my shadow long and thin on the concrete. I felt like a thief, yet I was the one who had paid for every stone of this place. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The scent of expensive jasmine diffusers filled the air, a smell I now associated with abandonment. I moved toward the office, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. My hands were steady now. The fear had been replaced by a cold, numbing purpose. I reached the safe hidden behind a fake bookshelf, a classic cliché Min thought was clever. I knew the code. It was his mother's birthday, the woman he claimed to love, the woman whose medical bills had drained my first retirement fund. He used her memory as a password for his greed. The safe clicked open. Inside were stacks of cash, several passports, and the black ledger. As I reached for it, a voice behind me shattered the silence. "I knew you couldn't stay away, Dad, but I didn't think you'd resort to burglary." I froze. I turned slowly to find Min leaning against the doorframe. He wasn't in his golf clothes. He was in his suit, looking sharp, looking dangerous. He wasn't angry. He looked disappointed, as if I were a pet that had finally misbehaved. "I forgot my watch," he lied smoothly, walking into the room. "And I see you found my private papers. You really don't know when to quit, do you? You think this makes a difference? You think a judge is going to listen to a senile old man who broke into his son's house?" He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "I told you, Dad. Raising you isn't my responsibility. And now you've made it even easier for me. I could call the police right by Joe. I could have you hauled off in handcuffs. Imagine how that would look. The sacrificing father caught stealing from the son he claims to love." I looked at him, really looked at him. I didn't see my son. I saw a monster I had accidentally created by giving too much and asking for too little. "I didn't come here to steal, Min," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "I came here to see if there was any part of you that felt guilty. But I see the ledger. I see the offshore accounts. You aren't just a bad son, you're a thief. Min laughed, a short, sharp sound. In this world, everyone is a thief, Dad. I just happen to be better at it than you. You spent your life being a good man, and look where it got you. A motel room and a suitcase. I'm building an empire. I won't let your outdated morals pull me down. He reached out and snatched the ledger from my hand, shoving me back. I stumbled against the desk, a sharp pain shooting through my hip. He didn't even flinch. "Get out," he hissed. "If I see you near this property again, I'll have a restraining order filed before you can catch the bus. Go find a park bench to die on. Our contract is officially over." I walked out of that house for the second time, but this time, I didn't cry. I waited until I reached the end of the block. Then I pulled a small, high-tech recording device out of my pocket, the one Mr. Vin had insisted I wear. I pressed the stop button. I had his voice, his confession, and his admission of the offshore accounts, all caught on tape. He thought he was the only lawyer in the family. He forgot that a father knows exactly how to bait a trap for the child he raised. The silent siege was over. It was time for the open war to begin. The recording was gold. When I played it back in Mr. Vin's office, the sound of Min's voice, cold, arrogant, and dismissive, filled the small room. Hearing him say, "I just happen to be better at it than you," made the air feel thick. Mr. Vin didn't smile, but he nodded slowly. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was evidence of a predatory mindset. "He fell for the oldest trick in the book," Vin said, leaning over his desk. "Ego. He wanted to gloat. He wanted to show you that he had won. But in doing so, he confirmed the existence of the offshore accounts and his intent to defraud you. This recording, combined with the photos you took earlier, gives us enough leverage to freeze his local assets before he can move them." But I knew Min. He was like a cornered rat, fast and vicious. If he realized I was coming for him legally, he would burn everything down just to keep me from having a single ash. I had to move faster than the legal system usually allowed. I spent the next few days in a state of hyper-awareness. I didn't return to the motel. Hung let me stay in a small room above his clock shop. The constant ticking of the gears was the only thing that kept my mind from fracturing. It reminded me that time was moving, and with every second, Min's empire was getting closer to a collapse he didn't see coming. While Mr. Vin prepared the filings, I decided to pay a visit to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Min's wife, Thu. She came from a wealthy family and had always treated me with a distant, polite coldness, as if I were a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the rest of the room. I met her at a high-end cafe near her gallery. When she saw me, she didn't hide her distaste. "Vu, I thought Min made it clear that we need space," she said, not even offering me a seat. "I'm not here for space, Thu," I said, sitting down anyway. My back ached, but I kept my posture straight. "I'm here to give you a warning. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about Project Legacy. And I know that your name is on several of those documents as a co-signatory." The color drained from her face so quickly, it was as if a mask had been stripped away. She tried to maintain her composure, but her hand trembled as she reached for her coffee. "I don't know what you're talking about. Min handles the finances." "That's a dangerous lie to tell a court," I replied quietly. "Min told me he has no responsibility to me. He said he's building an empire. But empires built on stolen money and forged signatures don't just fall. They crush everyone inside them. When the investigators start looking at the trust fund skimming, they won't care that you just handled the decorating. They'll see your signature on the shell company in the Cayman Islands." I saw the panic flash in her eyes. She wasn't like Min. She didn't have the stomach for a long war. She was a creature of comfort, and the thought of losing her status, or worse, her freedom, was more than she could bear. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want the truth," I said. "And I want the house back in my name." If you help me, if you provide the login credentials for those accounts and testify that Min forged my signature on the deed transfer, I'll make sure the lawyers know you were a victim of his manipulation. If you stay with him, you go down with him." I left her there, shaking, her expensive coffee untouched. I was gambling. I was betting that the greed that brought them together would be the very thing that tore them apart. In their world, loyalty was a currency, and they were both running out of it. That evening, Hung and I sat in the workshop. "You're playing a dangerous game, Vu," Hung warned. "You're turning a family into a battlefield." "They turned it into a battlefield the moment they decided my life was a line item they could delete," I said. "I spent 40 years being a father. Now, I'm being a teacher. I'm teaching them the one lesson I forgot to give them when they were young, that every action has a consequence, and you can't build a future by burying your past." Later that night, my phone buzzed. It was an email from an anonymous address. Inside were screenshots of bank transfers, internal memos from Min's law firm, and a scanned copy of the original deed before the gift transfer. Thu had broken. The fear of poverty was stronger than her love for her husband. As I scrolled through the evidence, I felt a strange sense of grief. This was my son's life, laid out in digital ink. Every document was a testament to his brilliance and his rot. He could have been anything. He could have been a great man. Instead, he was just a clever thief. The next morning, Mr. Vin met me with a heavy file. "The injunction has been granted, Vu. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Min's personal and business accounts are frozen. The process server is on his way to his office right now. By noon, his partners will know everything." I stood by the window of the dusty office, looking out at the city I had helped build, with my own 2 hands. The battle was no longer silent. The first blow had been struck. I felt no joy, only a grim satisfaction. The son who told me that raising a parent wasn't his responsibility was about to find out that being a son was a debt he could no longer afford to default on. "What's the next move?" I asked Vin. "Now," Vin said, "we wait for him to crawl. And he will crawl, Vu. Men like that always do when the money stops flowing." I nodded, clutching my suitcase. I was no longer the man who had been locked out in the rain. I was the architect of the storm that was about to break over my son's head. The fallout was swifter than a summer storm. By mid-afternoon, the world Min had meticulously constructed began to splinter. From my small room above Hung's shop, I could almost feel the tremors. Mr. Vin called me every hour with updates. The injunction had hit Min like a physical blow. When the process servers arrived at his prestigious firm, they didn't just hand over papers. They did it in front of his senior partners and a lobby full of high-net-worth clients. The shining star of the legal community was suddenly under a cloud of alleged fraud and elder abuse. I spent that evening staring at the wall, listening to the rhythmic ticking of Hung's clocks. Each tick felt like a heartbeat, or perhaps a countdown. I found myself thinking about the time Min was 6 years old and fell off his bike. He had scraped his knee raw, and I had carried him 3 miles home, whispering that everything would be okay. Now, I was the one causing the wound. I had to remind myself that the man I was fighting was no longer that boy. That boy died the moment he decided his father was a disposable commodity. Around 8 p.m., my phone began to explode. Missed calls from Min, missed calls from Lan, a flurry of text messages that shifted wildly in tone from outrage to pleading. I didn't answer. I followed Mr. Vin's instructions to the letter. Silence is your greatest weapon now, Vu. Let his own imagination torture him. But then a message came through from Lan that made my blood run cold. Dad, Min is spiraling. He's at the house and he's out of control. He thinks you've ruined everything. Please, come talk to him before he does something we all regret. My paternal instinct, that stubborn, irrational part of me that I couldn't quite kill, flared up. Against my better judgment, I told Hung I had to go. It's a trap, Vu, Hung said, grabbing my arm. He's a cornered animal. Don't go back there alone. He's still my son, Hung, I replied, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. If there's a chance to end this without a total massacre, I have to take it. When I arrived at the house, the iron gates were wide open. The front door was ajar. I walked inside to a scene of chaos. The jasmine-scented air was gone, replaced by the smell of spilled whiskey. Vases were shattered, and papers were strewn across the marble floor. Min was sitting on the floor in the center of the living room, his tie loosened, his expensive suit jacket discarded like trash. He looked up as I entered. His eyes were bloodshot, and for a moment I saw the ghost of the terrified child I used to know. But then the expression shifted into a sneer of pure venom. "The great benefactor returns," he slurred, gesturing with a glass of amber liquid. "Are you happy now, old man? My partners have put me on administrative leave. My accounts are locked. Even the car is technically not mine anymore. You didn't just want a room. You wanted my life." "I didn't want your life, Min," I said, standing near the doorway. "I wanted you to have a heart. I wanted you to remember who gave you the stairs you climbed." "Don't give me that sacrificial lamb routine," he screamed, standing up unsteadily. "You loved the struggle, Dad. You loved being the martyr. You used your poverty as a guilt trip for our entire lives. I worked for you. I bled for you. Well, I didn't ask you to. I didn't ask you to wear broken boots. That was your choice. And now you're punishing me for being exactly what you raised me to be. Someone who wins." It was a chilling perspective. To him, my love was a burden and my sacrifice was an insult. He saw my life's work not as a gift, but as a debt he never signed for. "I'm not punishing you for winning, Min," I said quietly. "I'm punishing you for cheating. You forged my name. You stole from the people who trusted you. You turned the home I built for our family into a money laundering tool. I could have forgiven the coldness. I could have even forgiven you kicking me out. But I cannot forgive you for becoming a thief in my name." Min lunged at me then, not with a weapon but with his hands, grabbing my coat. "Undo it," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Call your lawyer. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you were confused. If you don't, I'll lose everything." Thu is already packing her bags. "She's going to take the kids, Dad. Do you want that? Do you want your grandkids to grow up without a father because you were petty about a guest room?" The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. He was using the very children he had barely spent time with as shields. "You already lost them, Min," I said, prying his hands off me. "You lost them the moment you showed them that people are objects to be used. You want to save your empire? Then start by telling the truth. Give me back the deed. Admit to the fraud. Maybe then the judge will show you the mercy you didn't show me." He backed away, a hollow laugh escaping his throat. "Mercy? You don't know the meaning of the word. You're just like me, Dad. You're just better at hiding your claws behind a smile. You've spent your whole life saving, and now you're finally spending. You're spending your own son's future, just to feel powerful for one night." I turned to leave. There was nothing left to say. As I walked toward the door, he shouted after me, "I'll fight you on every line of that recording. I'll say you drugged me. I'll say you're senile." I didn't look back. As I stepped out into the night, I saw Lan standing by her car in the driveway crying. She looked at me with a mix of fear and judgment. "Was it worth it, Dad?" she asked. "Is the house worth destroying the family?" I stopped and looked at my daughter. The woman who had told me my presence was emotional labor. "The family was destroyed the night I was left in the rain, Lan," I said. "I'm just the one clearing away the rubble." I walked out of the gates and didn't stop until I reached the main road. The tide had turned, and while the victory felt like cold iron, it was the only thing I had left to hold on to. The siege was over. The trial was beginning. The legal proceedings moved with a cold, mechanical indifference that contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos of the past few weeks. Mr. Vin had filed a comprehensive lawsuit that didn't just target the property, deed, but also brought the recorded confessions and the evidence of financial irregularities to the attention of the Bar Association and the district prosecutor. Min's world was no longer just cracking. It was imploding. The man who once walked the halls of justice with the arrogance of a king was now being scrutinized by the very system he had manipulated. I spent my days sitting in the back of various legal offices or waiting in the hallway of the courthouse. I felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of my own life. People in expensive suits brushed past me, unaware that the old man in the corner was the one who had pulled the pin on a grenade that was currently leveling one of the city's rising legal stars. I watched as Min's partners officially severed ties with him, issuing a public statement that they had zero tolerance for unethical conduct. In the eyes of the elite, Min was already dead. One afternoon, Mr. Vin called me into his office. He looked tired, but his eyes held a grim satisfaction. "Thu has officially signed a cooperation agreement," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. She provided the digital keys to the offshore accounts and gave a sworn statement regarding the night Min forced you to sign those supplemental documents under the guise of insurance papers. She's looking to protect herself and the children, Vu. She's cutting him loose. I looked at the documents, but the words blurred together. I thought about how she had stood by while I was insulted, only to flip the moment her own comfort was threatened. There was no heroism in her actions, only survival. It was the same trait I saw in Min. They were two of a kind, and in the end, they were devouring each other. "What happens to the house?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The court has issued a preliminary ruling to restore the title to you, pending the final fraud investigation," Vin explained. "Min has 10 days to vacate the property. Since the funds he used to pay down the mortgage were proven to be diverted from your original savings and unjust enrichment from his clients, the property is legally yours again. You won, Vu. You won." Those words should have felt like a victory march. Instead, they felt like a heavy stone being placed on my chest. I had my house back, but it was an empty shell, haunted by the memories of a son who hated me, and a daughter who feared my labor. I walked out of the office and headed toward the park, sitting on a bench to watch the sunset. For the first time in my life, I had no overtime shift to go to, no bills to worry about, and no children to save for. I was wealthy, and I was utterly alone. As I sat there, Lan appeared. She had clearly been following the news. She didn't look like the polished, yoga-toned woman I saw at her apartment. Her eyes were puffy and her hair was a mess. She sat down at the far end of the bench, leaving a wide gap between us. "Min is going to prison, isn't he?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That's for the judge to decide, Lan," I replied. "He committed crimes. He didn't just hurt me. He hurt a lot of people." "But you could stop it." She turned to me, her voice rising in desperation. "You could tell them you made a mistake. You could drop the civil suit. If the civil suit goes away, the prosecutor might not have enough for the criminal charges. Dad, he's your son. How can you sleep at night knowing you put him in a cell?" I looked at her, and for a moment I saw the little girl who used to ask me to check under her bed for monsters. I realized then that I was the monster now. In their story, I wasn't the victim. I was the villain who dared to fight back. "I sleep at night because I finally stopped lying to myself, Lan," I said firmly. "I spent 40 years sleeping on a bed of lies, telling myself that if I gave you everything, you would grow up to be good people. I was wrong. I raised a thief and a bystander. You didn't care about my sleep when I was in that motel. You didn't care about the responsibility of a child until the money was at stake. We were just trying to live our lives," she cried. "At the expense of mine," I countered. "You keep talking about what I'm doing to him. Why don't you talk about what he did to me? He stole my name. He stole my security. He told me I was nothing. Why is his future more valuable than my dignity?" Lan had no answer. She stood up, looking at me with a coldness that mirrored her brother's. "You're a bitter old man, Dad. You've got your house, and you've got your revenge. I hope you enjoy the silence in those empty rooms. 'Cause from this day on, you don't have a daughter either." She walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. I watched her go, a strange sense of peace settling over me. The bridge wasn't just burned. The river itself had dried up. I went back to Hung's shop that night and helped him wind the clocks. "She came to see you, didn't she?" Hung asked without looking up. "She did," I said. "She told me I'm a bitter old man." Hung paused, a tiny brass gear held in his tweezers. "Better to be a bitter man with a roof over his head than a saint dying in the gutter, Vu. People only call you bitter when they can't use you anymore." The next week, I stood at the front door of my house. The locks had been changed. The moving trucks had come and gone, taking the mahogany table, the expensive art, and the jasmine diffusers. The house was echoing and bare. I walked into the kitchen and sat on the floor, the same place where Min had sat in his drunken rage. I ran my hand over the floorboards. I had paid for these. I had earned this. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized the drama wasn't over. The true test wasn't winning the house back. It was figuring out what a man does with a victory that tastes like salt. The silence in the house was a physical weight. Now that the lawyers were done and the shouting had ceased, I was left with the four walls I had spent my life building. Every room was a museum of a family that no longer existed. I walked into Min's old bedroom, then Lan's, seeing the faded squares on the wallpaper where their photos used to hang. It is a strange thing to win a war and realize the territory you've reclaimed is a graveyard. Min's legal team tried one final desperate maneuver. They attempted to paint me as mentally incompetent, claiming that the recording was a result of me confusing a father-son heart-to-heart with a business confession. They tried to say I was suffering from early-onset dementia and that my vengeful actions were a symptom of a decaying mind. It was a low blow, even for him. To be called crazy by the person who made you lose your mind is a special kind of agony. However, Mr. Vin was prepared. He brought in 3 independent medical evaluators and a forensic psychologist. They didn't just prove I was sane. They documented the narcissistic gaslighting I had been subjected to. The court transcript from that day was a masterpiece of exposure. When the judge looked at Min and asked why a confused father would have documentation for offshore accounts he shouldn't even know existed, Min had no answer. He just sat there, his expensive skin looking gray, his hands shaking under the table. But the real blow came from the bank. Because the house had been tied to his fraudulent investments, the bank initiated a clawback process on all of Min's other assets. To pay off the debts and avoid immediate seizure of his firm's remaining capital, Min was forced to sell everything: his cars, his club memberships, and his investments. He went from a multimillionaire to a man with a negative net worth in the span of a single month. He was experiencing the very bankrupt feeling I had carried into that motel. I received a letter in the mail, hand-delivered. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was a handwritten note from Min. "I hope you're happy. We're moving into a 2-bedroom apartment in a bad part of town. The kids have to change schools. Thu is filing for divorce. You didn't just take the house, Dad. You took their future. Is this the responsibility you wanted to teach me? To destroy your own grandkids' lives to prove a point?" I sat at my kitchen table, reading the note, over and over. A younger version of me would have crumbled. I would have called him, offered him money, and apologized for standing up for myself. But the man who worked 40 years in a factory was dead. The man who sat in the rain was the one who answered. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. He was still trying to use my love as a weapon against me, but he didn't realize that he had already fired all his bullets. I spent those weeks doing something I hadn't done in decades. I worked for myself. I cleaned the house. I repainted the walls. I pulled out the expensive, cold furniture they had left behind and replaced it with simple, sturdy pieces that reminded me of my own childhood. I invited Hung over. We sat on the porch, drinking tea and watching the sun set over the neighborhood. "He's still trying to guilt you," Hung said, nodding at the letter on the table. "He is," I said. "He thinks the kid's lifestyle is my responsibility. He still doesn't get it. He thinks responsibility is about tuition and cars. He doesn't realize it's about character. If I let him keep that stolen money, I'd be teaching those grandkids that crime pays if your father is the victim." "What are you going to do with the extra rooms, Vu?" Hung asked. "It's a big house for one man." I had been thinking about that. I thought about the government facilities Lan had mentioned with such disdain. I thought about the thousands of elderly people who were being pushed out of their homes by children just like mine, people who had no Mr. Vin, no Hung, and no recording devices. "I'm going to turn it into a foundation," I said. "A sanctuary for people who gave everything to their families and were left with nothing. I'll use the settlement money from the fraud case to fund it. I don't want to live in a mansion. I want to live in a home where responsibility actually means something." As I spoke the words, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just a victim, and I wasn't just a survivor. I was becoming the person I should have been a long time ago, someone who defined his own value. But the drama had one last twist. One evening, as I was locking the gate, a car pulled up. It wasn't Min or Lan. It was my eldest grandson, Tuan. He was 18, just starting college. He looked at me with a look I couldn't decipher, half fear, half curiosity. "Grandpa?" he asked softly. "Tuan, what are you doing here?" "My dad says you're a monster," the boy said, his voice cracking. "He says you stole our inheritance, but I remember how you used to carry me on your back. I remember you buying me that bicycle. I wanted to know, why? Why did it have to come to this?" I looked at my grandson, the one piece of the future that wasn't yet corrupted. I opened the gate and gestured for him to come in. "Sit down, Tuan," I said. "It's time someone told you the truth about how this house was built. Not with inheritance, but with a father's life. And it's time you learned why some things are worth more than a bank account." The conversation lasted until dawn. I showed him the ledgers. I showed him the photos. I told him about the rain. For the first time, a member of my family looked at me and didn't see a bank, but a human being. The conversation with Tuan was the first time in years I felt a bridge being built instead of being burned. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the living room floor, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in his father's for decades: empathy. He didn't look at the house as a prize he had lost. He looked at it as a testament to a life he had never fully understood. When he left that morning, he didn't call me a monster. He hugged me, a hesitant, awkward embrace that felt more valuable than the deed in my safe. But as the door closed behind him, I knew that my victory was about to face its final, most public test. The criminal trial for Min's financial crimes was set to begin. The news had already picked up the story. The fall of a prominent lawyer at the hands of his own father. The headlines were sensational. The price of ingratitude, the father who fought back. I hated the attention, but Mr. Vin insisted it was necessary. "The public needs to see this, Vu. You aren't just testifying for yourself. You're testifying for an entire generation that has been told they are a burden." The day of the trial, the courthouse was swarming with reporters. I walked through the crowd, leaning on my cane, feeling every one of my 70 years. Inside the courtroom, the air was cold and smelled of floor wax and old wood. I sat on the witness stand, and for the first time in months, I looked directly at Min. He wasn't wearing his $5,000 suit. He was wearing a plain, cheap charcoal one, and his face was gaunt. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the floor wasn't just cracking, it was gone. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued man who tried to use every trick in the book, started the cross-examination. "Mr. Vu," he began, pacing in front of the stand, "you claim your son defrauded you. But isn't it true that you gave him this money voluntarily? Isn't it true that you wanted him to succeed?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. I gave it voluntarily because I believed in the bond of family. I wanted him to succeed so he could be a good man, not just a rich one. And when he didn't live up to your personal expectations of gratitude, you decided to destroy his career. Isn't this just a case of a bitter father wanting control? I looked at the judge, then at the jury. Control. I spent 40 years in a factory so I would never have to control my children. I wanted them to be free. But freedom isn't the right to steal. Freedom isn't the right to forge a father's signature while he sleeps in the next room. My son says that raising a parent isn't a child's responsibility. I can accept that. But I cannot accept that a child has the right to strip a parent of their dignity and their survival just because they are done with them. A murmur went through the room. I saw Min put his head in his hands. The lawyer tried to pivot, bringing up the recording. This recording was taken, without consent, in a private home. It shows a man in a moment of extreme stress. It shows a man who thought he was untouchable. I interrupted. It shows a man who told his father to find a park bench to die on. Stress doesn't create a heart of stone. It only reveals it. The trial lasted 3 days. It was a grueling parade of bank statements, forged documents, and testimonies from former colleagues who were all too happy to kick a man while he was down. The most painful moment, however, was when Lan was called to testify. She stood there, looking at me with a mixture of hatred and grief. She tried to defend Min, but under Mr. Vin's questioning, she had to admit she knew about the Project Legacy plan. She had to admit she knew I was being moved to a facility against my will. When she stepped down, she wouldn't even look at me. She left the courtroom in tears, a victim of her own silence. I realized then that I hadn't just lost a son. I had lost a daughter to the same cult of selfishness. They were so busy protecting their lifestyle that they had forgotten how to protect their souls. The jury didn't take long. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement, and elder financial abuse, the room was silent. Min didn't scream. He didn't protest. He just slumped in his chair as the bailiff approached him. The judge, a woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, looked at Min before sentencing. "Mr. Min," she said, her voice echoing, "you spoke of responsibility. You are right that the law cannot force a child to love a parent. But the law can, and will, punish a person who uses love as a vacuum to suck the life out of another. You didn't just break the law. You broke a fundamental contract of humanity." He was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. As they led him out in handcuffs, he finally looked at me. There was no anger left, only a profound, hollow fear. He looked like the boy who had lost his soccer game, looking for a trophy I could no longer buy for him. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. Mr. Vin shook my hand. "It's over, Vu. You have your justice." "Justice is a cold comfort, Vin," I said, "but it's better than the alternative." I went home to my empty house. I sat in the kitchen and made a pot of tea. The house didn't feel like a graveyard anymore. It felt like a blank page. I had the deed, I had the money, and I had the truth, but as I looked at the empty chairs, I knew that the final chapter of this story wouldn't be written in a courtroom. It would be written in the lives of the people I would now use this house to help. The father who saved for his children was gone. The man who would save his peers was just beginning to find his way. The dust has finally settled on the battlefield of my life. The house, once a symbol of my sacrifice, and then a monument to my betrayal, has undergone its final transformation. I didn't sell it and I didn't hide inside it. Instead, I opened the doors. Today, the Harmony Home Foundation is a reality. Those empty bedrooms that once echoed with the cold words of my children are now filled with the laughter and stories of others like me, elderly men and women who found themselves discarded by the families they gave everything to. We share meals, we share the gardening, and most importantly, we share the dignity that was almost stolen from us. Min is serving his time. I visit him once a month. We don't talk about money, and we don't talk about the law. We sit in silence, behind a glass partition, and I look for the son I once knew. Sometimes, for a fleeting second, I see a glimmer of remorse in his eyes, a realization that the empire he tried to build was nothing more than a cage. Lan remains distant, living a life of quiet struggle, finally learning the true cost of independence without a foundation of love. I hope one day she finds her way back, not for my sake, but for hers. I realized that my life wasn't a waste. I spent 40 years saving money, but in the end, I was actually saving my soul. I learned that being a parent is a responsibility, yes, but being a human being is a choice we make every single day. I chose to forgive, but I also chose to stand tall. I am no longer a ghost in my own home. I am the master of my sunset years, surrounded by a family of choice, proving that blood may make you related, but loyalty and respect make you a family. As I sit on the porch this evening, Tuan is here helping me with the roses. He is the bridge to a better future. A young man who knows that wealth is measured in character, not just currency. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, and for the first time in a very long time, I am at peace. I gave my life for my children, but I reclaimed it for myself, and that is the greatest saving of all. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey today. This story is a reminder that we must value those who sacrificed for us before they are gone. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Dr. Harmony and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story of the human heart. Until next time, stay strong and stay kind.